Okay, thank you everyone so much for coming to our first November Sagan National Colloquium. I am super excited to see so many of you, even though we are late in the semester, because tonight offers a special treat. Dr. Meredith Palmer is returning to OBU. She graduated in 2011, and she'll tell you what she's been up to since she left. I want to take a moment and just remind you, I see lots of familiar faces in the audience, but also some people who might not have been to one of these events yet this semester. We are bringing back series of OWU alumni to share their career stories and to talk to you about their experiences both here and after their time at Ohio Wesleyan. We have several really extraordinary events left. I know that it's late November, but we've saved some of the best for last. And this Friday, we have two events this week. Our next event is this Friday, when a panel of award-winning journalists are going to return to campus and talk to you about not only their careers, but also the ways that they've seen journalism change and transform over the course of their careers. This is a big issue in today's climate. Is what is news, and what is the goal of news, and what is the purpose of news media. And so I encourage you all to join us here on Friday and hear from 4 of our very distinguished Ohio Wesleyan alumni as they navigate that conversation. And then we have Martha Park coming next Tuesday to talk about her combination of fine arts and creative writing. She works with graphic novelists and graphic illustration. And then we have Cameron Hewitt, who is an award-winning travel writer, coming soon. I can't remember the date off the top of my head. My head's full. Cameron Hewitt coming to talk about his path from OWU to the world. And then we will cap the series off with the return of Joshua Mandelbaum, who was an English creative writing major and is now running a nonprofit school called Superhero Academy for creative writing for young children in New York City. So hope to see you at more of those events. But now, without further ado, Dr. Palmer.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction. I wanted to start my presentation by doing a few introductions of my own. Does anyone recognize who this person is? This is Dr. David Livingstone. He was a Victorian-era explorer who was obsessed with mapping unexplored regions of Africa. He ended up questing for the source of the Nile, got stuck in a Congolese village for 6 years before being rediscovered by the reporter Henry Stanley in 1869. These gentlemen are from Scott of the Antarctic expeditions to the polar regions, also in the early 1900s. These men trekked across frozen tundras and got trapped in pack ice and ate tons of penguins and made some fantastic discoveries about these unexplored lands. The fossils that they pulled out of Scott's frozen dead hands, because that expeditions didn't end very well for him, those fossils helped prove that Antarctica used to be connected to other continents. This man is Roy Chapman Andrews. Roy Chapman Andrews in the early 20th century was an adventurer and a paleontologist with the American Natural History Museum. He led expeditions across the Gobi Desert into Mongolia, searching for dinosaurs. He's the reason that we know things like dinosaurs came from eggs. He's also the reason that we have the whole Indiana Jones franchise, because Indiana Jones is based on Roy Chapman Andrews. And these, of course, are our British naturalist explorers, our man Charles Darwin, his contemporary Alfred Russel Wallace. These two Brits on their voyages of discovery between them went to South America, Africa, Australia, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, all of these different locales in their quest to observe and understand the natural world. And through a combination of my dad being a massive history buff and me being a massive nerd, these were all of my heroes growing up. And what do these people have in common? These people all went out into the world. They explored exciting new places. They met interesting new people. They saw fantastic new wonders of nature. They discovered something new. They changed how we think about the world we live in. So there's not a whole lot of blank spaces left to fill in on the map. But for a scientist, for a zoologist, there's still a lot of terra incognita left in the natural world. There's still so much about wild spaces and natural systems that we still don't understand. And there's still quite a bit of adventure left to be had on the quest for that knowledge. So although the flaming cliffs of Mongolia were taken by Andrews, and although I haven't frozen to death in the Antarctic like Scott did, I've still been chased by lions and laid low by malarial fever and discovered just a few interesting things about our world. So we now know just a little bit more than we did before. And this mission of discovery for me has also sort of morphed into a mission of conservation as well. It's hard to watch feral dogs devour the last nest of sea turtle eggs, or to fly in over the burning remnants of a Bornean rainforest, or to work on islands surrounded by oceans of garbage without feeling these very profound senses of loss and sorrow and urgency and motivation to try and make the world a slightly better place than it is right now. So what else do these people have in common? They're all men, they're all white, they're all privileged, they're all colonial. They haven't necessarily had the most savory relationships with the people and countries that they've interacted with. At the very least, the people who benefited from these men's expeditions and explorations were not the people whose countries were being exploited. And so in addition to my research, I focus a great deal of energy now on education, both on growing students as scientists, but also on changing the public's perception of what science is. And I'm working right now, along with so many others, to change this hall of heroes from a parade of old white men to a sort of parade of people that everyone can relate to. I am what a scientist looks like. You are what a scientist looks like. There's so many different ways for people to participate in science, and these experiences of research and discovery should be made available to everyone. So discovery, conservation, and education are the three themes I want to talk to you guys about tonight, both how these are sort of interwoven into the work I do right now, but also how exploring these different facets of science has gotten me to this point. And so I want to start off with discovery, with research. I am a large carnivore ecologist. I graduated from OWU in 2011. You can't see this, it's very dark. This is me, those are lions. I graduated from OWU in 2011. I ended up doing my Ph.D. working with the Serengeti Lion Project in Tanzania. And I now work to understand and protect large carnivore populations across the North American and African continents. And so the focus of my research is really on understanding predator-prey interactions. on figuring out how these carnivores and how the threat of being eaten by these carnivores shapes the daily lives and activities of large herbivore species. Because these interactions between predators and prey, they help to structure ecological communities. These interactions, if we can figure out and untangle these complex animal communities, we can start figuring out what allows for such fantastic biodiversity in nature to arise and be maintained. And we can then use that knowledge to conserve systems that have experienced extinction and loss of keystone species. Knowing how predator-prey interactions work and what they look like, that helps us to reconstruct these crucial ecological relationships when we're attempting to rebuild degraded communities. And so this is the discovery, this is the conservation, these are those two aspects of the work that I do now. And when I started off in zoology, these were really the only things I wanted to focus on. I wanted to spend as much time as humanly possible grubbing around in the wilds by myself. But research and conservation, they can't run on the backs of scientists alone. We need the enthusiasm and the buy-in and the understanding of the general public for these initiatives to succeed. And we need to be growing the next generation of change makers for these initiatives to continue. And so a significant component of my current research focuses on education, on engaging people in science, in broadening participation, particularly of underrepresented groups in STEM. And so we do this through a sort of multi-pronged approach. I do a great deal of work now in citizen science. I have online platforms where anyone can log in and they can engage directly with real ongoing science projects, with real data that we collect as we collect it from the field. We then also try and use these real data and these opportunities for students to engage with these real data and build off of those and build tools that teachers and students can use to engage with data in the classroom. So we've been building a variety of multimedia, of educational, freely available educational material based on our research that can be used by K-12 undergraduate and graduate students, giving them a chance to participate again in real science. I also do a great deal of capacity building work. So on a local scale, the field sites that I work in, the countries that host me, I lead a number of workshops, classes, courses to try and share the knowledge that we have and build foundations for stronger research and conservation in Africa moving forward. We have such a long history of going into these kinds of places and just taking knowledge without giving knowledge back. And this mission of capacity building, I think, is one of the most crucial aspects of the work that I do as a researcher from the global north, conducting science in Africa. And these opportunities also give us a chance to showcase diversity in science. I think it's important not just to engage people in science, but to show people what scientists are and what scientists look like. Without role models and without representation, people don't realize that they can do things. People don't realize that they can go on expeditions and that they can learn stats and learn coding and that they can take leadership positions and that they can be a scientist. So I work with a number of other women scientists specifically, trying to go out and serve as a demonstration of what scientists can be and what a scientist looks like. So before I take a deeper dive into those three different initiatives that I talked about, I just wanted to take a step back for a second to talk about my journey to this point. What did I do? What did I do to prepare myself at the moment for all of the things that I've suddenly found myself engaging in as part of my career? And of course, for me, it all started out at OWU. It started out here. Less than 10 years ago, I was also running around the science building and sorting jars of dead things in the Zoology Museum and bothering all of the zoology professors and trying to lay a foundation for my future. And so I just wanted to talk about some of the things that I think are worth taking advantage of at OWU. I think there were two things in particular that I got out of my OWU experience that I didn't really appreciate until a lot later on in my academic career. And one of them is definitely the diverse array of research experiences that we're exposed to, the array of questions that we're taught to ask, and things that we're able to participate in the zoology department. Whether that is digging around in roadkill looking for parasites, or swabbing wild birds for microbes, figuring out just what makes fish so sexy to other fish. I did a very brief and perhaps disastrous independent study in organic chemistry, but still came away with a couple of useful research skills. I got to do some of that all-important grubbing around in the field through our courses with Dr. Gatz here in Delaware, and really got bitten by that fieldwork bug in the classes that we're able to take in the Galapagos and Costa Rica and places like that. And it was really these undergraduate years that were my gateway drug to fieldwork. There were so many opportunities here to go out and explore and do science, and I became addicted. The fieldwork is bugs and sweat and humidity and long hours and dreadful food, and it is the most amazing experience you can have. And so for those of you, I've talked to some of you today, students in the zoology department right now, who are looking to break into the field of fieldwork. I just wanted to quickly go through some of the experiences I had here, some of the different ways to get these kinds of experiences that I highly recommend taking advantage of. So OWU offered a diversity of scholarships, of funding. I applied 1 year for funding to OWU to go to a field school in Costa Rica to study primates. And the field school was a valuable experience. We got to meet with famous big-name professors from other universities who came in and taught about this discipline. We got to help graduate students collect real data for their theses. We ran around conducting behavioral observations on spider monkeys and waiting for howler monkeys to poop, because poop, very important for scientists. There's so much information you can get out of poop. Anyone looking to go into biology should definitely get used to the idea that your future is going to hold a lot of poop. So field school, learned about poop. The theory into practice grants, those were really fundamental for me for being able to explore different facets of wildlife biology. I was able to really do a deep dive into conservation biology by going to Borneo one summer and working with local community-based organizations to build sustainable ecotourism initiatives. And I think the key takeaway for me here was this idea of exposure to community-driven conservation and communities profiting off of this sustainable use of their local wildlife. OWU offered not only financial support to get into the field, but also provided these valuable connections with the broader research community. So there was 1 year, I was a religious attendee of the OWU Science Seminar series. And 1 year we had a professor from Harvard come in and talk about his work using robots to study communication in lizards. His honest to God, grown-up adult human job was to run around in the field with robot lizards. And I thought that was pretty much the coolest thing you could do. So he came, he talked to OWU, I talked with him afterwards, we sent emails afterwards, we chatted afterwards, and he ended up hiring me to come down and work with him for a summer in Puerto Rico, studying communication in lizards, but unfortunately not communication in robot lizards. I didn't get to use any robots. It was soul crushing, but it was a valuable experience nonetheless. And then the research experiences for undergraduates are incredible. You get paid to spend a summer with real scientists doing real science. These experiences were something that I had to work really hard to get. I definitely got turned down the first time I applied for an REU, but I reapplied the next year, and I was fortunate enough to get this amazing job studying anti-predator behaviors in these amazing tree frogs at the Smithsonian Tropical Institute in Panama. We did a summer's worth of work. We collected real data. We got a publication out of a summer's worth of undergraduate field work. And that looks so good on our applications, but is also such a great experience to have of going through that entire process. And that's the other thing that I wanted to highlight about what we can get out of the OU Zoology department is the support in so many ways for us to grow and develop as real scientists. Because science isn't just grubbing around in the field, like up to our eyeballs in poop and leeches, and there's like a little bit more to science than that. Science is learning about the discoveries that came before you and taking that data that you collected and processing it and analyzing it and writing it up and trying to put it into this broader context. And we have fantastic and fantastically patient professors here who help guide us through this process and who help us make these real contributions to the broader body of knowledge. And that was like getting a taste of that experience was indescribably important for how I was able to approach science moving forward. And as an undergraduate, I really met all of the people that I wanted to be when I grew up. Here in the OU Zoology department, we're surrounded by so many strong women in science. And in the field work that I was able to do, all of these different experiences, I got to meet and interact with absolutely incredible minority, POC, queer, women and people in science. I got to meet people from Central America and South America and Malaysia who were just taking an active role in research in their own countries. And these experiences shaped my idea of who I thought a scientist could be, and kind of fostered this idea in myself that maybe I could be a scientist too. So that idea of what a scientist is, me maybe being a scientist, that would be cool. That took a bit of a hit when I applied. I applied and failed to get into graduate school out of undergraduate. It was hard. It was like I had liked school. I was good at school. I was good at science. I had these experiences. The plan was sort of just keep going in academia all the way, right? Like master's, Ph.D, something, save the world. Right. Had a plan, and then I didn't have a plan. And it was soul-crushing both to my idea that I could do this kind of research, but then also, what was I supposed to do with myself now? But in retrospect, thank goodness I didn't get into graduate school. There are so many other opportunities out there to engage meaningfully in science. And I cultivated so many incredible experiences and skill sets in my years off from academia. These were the years where I got shot at by poachers and swam with sharks. And I learned how to drive a manual and manage a field expedition. And I wrote scientific papers and I cultivated scientific connections. And I had all of these different experiences which were important for me in shaping and refining the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask. As an undergraduate, I was completely clueless, and I think most undergraduates are, right? It was not just me. I had no idea what I wanted to do, and having all of these different experiences in science that I cultivated after graduate school were important in helping me refine my idea of the kinds of questions that I wanted to spend the rest of my life pursuing. So there were really 3 different kinds of jobs that I took after getting out of undergraduate, where I was engaging in science. And the first was as a field assistant. So I worked for universities, but I was out in the field helping them collect data and maintain these long-term projects. So one of the first field assistant jobs I had, I was able to go to South Africa. I worked in this absolutely gorgeous succulent Karoo desert studying social behavior in mice. And so the Karoo is this desert of extremes. It has extreme temperatures, extreme climate, and we were really interested in how these mice, their flexibility to be or not be social, depending on the kind of environmental pressures they faced. So we caught these mice, we put radio collars on these mice, we trapped these mice, we followed these mice. We spent hours and hours and hours a day watching these mice, what they did and who they did it to. I think the most important scientific skill I cultivated in this internship was the fine art of mouse painting. So it's very difficult. All mice look the same. Very difficult to tell mice apart when you're observing them in the field. So we would regularly catch our mice, bleach our mice, hair dye our mice, so that we could tell apart like red butt from white jacket. So skills, the skills you cultivate outside of academia are important. Another field assistant job I did, I worked for almost a year on the beautiful Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. And so this project wasn't about behavior, it was about ecology and evolution and the interaction between those 2 forces in real time. And so we used guppies, a kind of fish, as our study system, or as our model organism, and we had all of these mountain streams which served as replicates in our natural experiment. And fish in these different mountain streams were exposed to different levels of predation pressure and competition and resources. And so every couple of weeks, me and my crew would hike out like through the fertilances, up waterfalls, over spiders, like through the rocks, up to these mountain streams. We would fish out each and every single fish from the mountain streams, which is a mission. Lug them all back to lab, count them, measure them, lug them back up, release them, and do the same thing over and over again to study how these populations changed. Oh yeah, so on my count of, fun experiences in the field, tropical diseases, I got tons of those. Trinidad and Tobago, foot rot, dengue fever, bot flies. Yeah, that was fun. So those were my field assistant jobs. Those were working with universities. I also got to go back to South Africa and did a stint working for a conservation NGO, assisting with reintroducing wildlife to private game reserves. And so here, this was really my first introduction to working with large African herbivores, which I work with now. It was a crash course in navigating the political park system in South Africa, which is a mess. But we spent our time, we were interested in maintaining viable populations of ungulates and reserves and maintaining genetic diversity. We would go to these game auctions to buy different kinds of wild animals and release them. Tick bite fever. It's like the flu, but you get auditory hallucinations. That took me out for 3 weeks. That was good. So working for an NGO, that was another kind of job. The best kind of job I had was working for the government. So did you know that the US government pays people to go out and catch snakes? This is your tax dollars at work. So I got to work on the beautiful island of Guam. It's an island in the South Pacific. It is absolutely infested with invasive reptiles. There are more of these brown tree snakes per square mile on the island of Guam than there are in the Amazon basin. And so these snakes, they came to the island of Guam decades ago. They decimated all of the native wildlife on these islands. They ate every single bird and every single mammal, and the only wildlife left on these islands is snakes. And so it was our job with the US government to study the ecology of these invasions, how they got there, how they travel around the island, how they reproduce, all of these pieces of information, so that if these snakes ever traveled anywhere else, we could stop them. And so the great thing about working on Guam, one of the interesting things about working on this island, is that it served as a military base during World War II. And a really great thing about working for the government is that you get health care. And that ended up being really important because it was not uncommon for us to be running around our field sites at night and discover unexploded bombs from the war on our quest to go find snakes. So a different kind of field hazard on Guam. But so I did all of these different experiences. I worked for universities, I worked for the government, I didn't work for the government. I got to go to some fantastic places and meet fantastic people. But after a while, I got bored. And I didn't get bored of the adventure, but I got bored of answering other people's questions for them. I got bored of not having the chance, like I was in these amazing places and these amazing systems, and I didn't get to address any of the questions of my own. So I was on Guam, I was stuck on Guam. It's a small island, it's 3 miles long, there's not a lot to do. I had a lot of time to plan. I wrote a lot of grants. I got funding to go back to graduate school. And I was able this time with my funding to go to the Ph.D., my top choice Ph.D. program, the Ph.D. program of my dreams. But the friends I made, the colleagues I made on these different experiences, a lot of them still do the jobs that I met them while doing. And they're still happy doing those jobs. And it's fulfilling for them. And they make far more money than I will ever make as an academic. And these are not, like, these are viable, good ways to participate in science. But going back into academia was the right choice for me. So it was in graduate school that I really started the research that lays the foundation for my current career, for the work I do now. I worked mostly in Tanzania, but also ran projects in Botswana, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa. I got to meet and work with some incredibly innovative and passionate people, and learned a lot about all of the challenges and opportunities of conducting research and conservation across Africa. And we had our fair share of adventures too, not so many diseases, some adventures which ended less well than others. There were we had a good time. There were definitely times we got chased by lions. There were times when we had to deal with very uncooperative field equipment. And there was one time where we accidentally ended up in a brothel by mistake. So things happened in Africa that stayed in Africa. It's an adventure every day. But so graduate school was good. Graduate school was also not good. Graduate school was the place where I got introduced to the idea that it was going to be difficult being a woman in science. And I think maybe more so in the field of African ecology and large carnivore ecology, which is very male dominated, and definitely more so in some of the cultures and communities that I was interacting with on the ground. They weren't necessarily as progressive as others, but I think some of these barriers exist across disciplines regardless. I had challenges getting people to listen to me. I had challenges getting funding. I had challenges getting accepted to groups and conferences, and I faced harassment and discrimination in the science and management communities. I watched people in power make decisions about other people's futures based on how attractive they were. And even I have been told in different contexts that I am either not attractive enough or too feminine to be taken seriously in my field. And I have over a dozen papers. I have awards, I have grants, I have all of these indicators of being a successful academic, and I still struggle to be taken seriously in my own field. This was also the time where I became acutely aware of how dangerous it can be to be a woman in the field, doing field work. A lot of the work I do for my current job is me alone in countries where women don't necessarily have a lot of respect or rights. And I know these comics are really busy and I don't expect you to read them, but I think this last panel sort of really hits home this feeling that I work with these large carnivores that have teeth and claws, and they could rip me limb from limb if they wanted to. But I'm still often a lot more afraid of some of the people that I encounter than the predators I work with. So it can be difficult, it can be scary, and it's not going to change without getting more women in science. We need you getting out there, helping us change the system. So that was a little real talk, that was a little dark. So I want to talk now about all of the things that make it worthwhile. The parts of my job that like why I do what I do. So starting with my research, as I mentioned before, I'm interested in species interactions and how they structure larger ecological communities, how the effects of one animal interacting with another can trickle down to have these far-reaching community consequences, with a specific focus on how predators and prey interact with each other. And to study this, I use several different kinds of ways to collect data. I work primarily with long-term camera trap surveys. So camera traps are these remote cameras, you leave them in the field, they're triggered to take pictures of passing wildlife. Use a lot of camera trapping, rely a lot on long-term predator monitoring surveys. So programs that have captured and collared predators and who have followed their populations and their behavioral interactions and social structure through time. I also get to do a lot of fun predator simulation experiments. These are the great. I've spent a lot of time in my PhD pretending to be a predator. Whether that is smelling like a predator, which instead of poop involves a lot of pee, so also add that to your list of things. Sounding like a predator or using a lot of really fun predator models. So we use all of these different methods to collect data. And then the question I'm interested in understanding is how these carnivores shape prey behavior, about how prey decide what kinds of strategies they're going to use to avoid becoming a predator's lunch. And so that might be something like trying to avoid encountering predators in the first place, all the way down to the different behaviors that prey make to escape predator encounters. And it's been very difficult because these kinds of animals are large and they move very far every day. Their interactions take place over these very vast spatial and temporal scales. It's historically been very difficult to study these behavioral strategies in the wild. So there's still a lot for us to understand about behavior in these kinds of systems. So one option that prey have is to try and avoid running into predators in the first place. And it seems that prey sort of develop this mental map that they navigate their landscape in terms of the relative risk and safety associated with different areas. So the goal is you want to avoid the rivers where lions hang out. You want to avoid the trees that are always full of leopards. But sometimes all of the water that you need and all of the food that you need are in those rivers and in those trees. And then you have to make all kinds of interesting behavioral trade-offs about your decision to stay as far away from predators as possible, or when you go in and try and get all of those things that you need, that you also need to stay alive. Oops, is this gonna work? Here we go. So for all of the evading predators that you can do, there's still gonna be situations where you encounter predators and you need to escape. So of course, one thing you can do when you encounter a predator is to run away. But you can also freeze. You can also alarm call. You can even attack the predator yourself. And we see this whole host of different kinds of anti-predator behaviors that prey perform, and they don't always perform the same kind of behavioral strategy towards in each predator encounter scenario, which suggests that certain behaviors are adaptive for escaping from certain kinds of predators. Oops. And so that's why Africa is a really, that is a predator. So that's why Africa is a really great system to study these kinds of questions, because we do have a diversity of predators there that prey are trying to not get eaten by. We have predators that are ambush hunters that do a stalk and a chase. We have predators that rely on endurance to run you down. We have predators that are active at night and predators that are active during the day. We have predators that hunt alone and hunt in groups. And it gives us this kind of diversity to explore these different kinds of behavioral responses. But as I mentioned, another thing I'm interested in is the cascading consequences of these behaviors. So what if an antelope decides that it's just not going to go to that lion-y part of the landscape, versus it is going to go to that part of the landscape and just rely on trying to run away from predators? Those are two choices you could make, but those choices have different impacts. So one of those scenarios might result in having very strong cascading consequences for those areas that are full of lions in terms of what the plant communities might look like, what the soil communities might look like. Whereas the other response might change prey stress and physiology and reproduction and population dynamics in a way where you have lower impacts on the larger community, but spread out over broader areas, which I will elaborate on at my talk tomorrow at noon in the Science Center. So this idea of behavior causing what we would call trophic cascades, a behavioral trickling from the predator-prey interface down to affect other community processes, is very interesting and something that we don't know a whole lot about in these kinds of systems. This is something that I've been examining in North American systems where wolves have been recolonizing. And so there's a great deal of controversy at the moment as to whether wolves affect prey behavior in a way that can restore degraded systems. So some people believe that wolves, which were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995, that they changed elk behavior in a way that allowed these wonderful riparian river systems to recover. But these studies are based on a single instance, and they're observational in nature, and they don't have replication, and they can't establish cause and effect. So I've been working with recolonizing wolves in Minnesota, running these slightly more rigorous experiments to see if I can, first of all, decompose the predator effects, the effects of predators eating prey versus predators changing prey behavior, and evaluate the relative strengths of those two different pathways on affecting these plant communities, soil communities, these like lower trophic processes. So this predator's prey behavior is what I'm supposed to be known for. If you happen to Google my name, what you'll actually find a lot more media on is one discovery I happened to make during my Ph.D., that there is a species of bird which spends the night roosting in giraffe crotches, and people like that, and this is now my actual science legacy. And if you remember anything from this talk and you don't remember anything about wolves or lions, like please remember the crotch birds. This is part of science, this is part of discovery, yeah. Crotch birds, discovery, conservation. So, again, as I've been saying, understanding how these communities are structured, how these players interact with each other, how everything fits together, that kind of information can help us both to predict what happens as you start losing players from that system, as you start pulling those interaction webs apart. But also, it can give you an idea of how to best put missing players back in. So I just wanted to quickly touch on some of the restoration efforts that I've been involved in over the last couple of years. My new primary field site is the Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. And this park used to be back in the 60s and the 70s, this gem of Africa, this beautiful biodiverse system just brimming with wildlife. Until 1977, we have the Mozambican Civil War. We have this civil war that lasts for almost 2 decades, and the park is full of guerrilla fighters and refugees and poachers, and they decimate the wildlife populations. They remove every animal, essentially bigger than a mongoose, from the park. It's completely defaunated. But thankfully, in recent years, the war ended, I think, in 1992, 1994, very recently. In the last 5 or 6 years, thanks to some collaborations between US funders and the Mozambican government, we've been attempting to repopulate this system, to rebuild the community that existed here before the war. And so we finally have all of the pre-war herbivores are back, but not in the same numbers or in the same relative proportions as they were before the war. And we think that that's the consequence of predators not having a toehold in the system yet. We don't have large carnivores back, and those predators aren't exerting those top-down predator impacts that we've been talking about, and that's why our prey populations are really out of whack. But we're making progress in that area. As of last Monday, I think, as of last week, we've now had 2 successful wild dog relocations into the park. We brought 2 packs of wild dogs in from South Africa, and encouragingly, they seem to be doing really well. We had our first litter of puppies this year, and so what we'll be doing is monitoring, as these predator populations become more established, the effects on how many prey there are and where they are and what they do, and keep tabs on that as we continue to reintroduce more predator species. I'm also interested in lion reintroduction efforts in South Africa. So South Africa, again, in the early 1900s, essentially all large carnivores are extirpated from across the country. In the 1980s, thanks to conservation and tourism, have driven efforts to try and restore some of these historic predator populations. So I work with a South African organization called the Lion Management Forum, and we're interested in figuring out ways to make these lion reintroductions as successful as possible. And currently, our big problem is prey naivete. These prey animals have lived for 100 years without predators. They have no ecological experience with their natural enemies, and they have no idea what to do when you throw a lion back in. And some prey species, they just get completely wiped out when you put predators back into these reserves. Some prey species don't. And so we're trying to understand the different mechanisms and pathways by which prey learn or remember the appropriate anti-predator behaviors so that we can start priming our naive prey populations for the reintroduction of predators in a way where they don't just all get eaten and immediately die. So we're working on that in South Africa. The other reintroduction I wanted to mention very quickly doesn't involve predators, but involves another kind of ecosystem engineer, mega herbivores. And all of you should know about the plight of rhinos in Africa. It is tragic, it is horrific. These populations are declining incredibly rapidly due to illegal poaching for their horns. And just a few weeks ago, I was in Tanzania assisting with the largest ever relocation of black rhino back into the country. We brought in 9 black rhino from South Africa and released them in the Western Serengeti. And it was a monumental logistical, political, financial endeavor. And I'm so incredibly proud of everyone involved in this project who helped pull it off. So I was not involved in flying rhinos in and keeping them in bonas, but I will be working with the park services, using our camera traps and using our collars to monitor the effects on the larger wildlife community of returning these mega herbivores back into this system. And then very quickly touching on some of the educational work that we do. Again, I'm interested in broadening participation in science and exposing people to science and to helping people understand what science is and who scientists are. And one of the biggest efforts we do to increase scientific literacy is to lure people into science by having them help us with our real science, with our ongoing data. So I run a number of projects which started out really as a desperate research cry for help and ended up being a very productive interaction between us and members of the general public. So I mentioned we use camera traps in our research. Camera traps take pictures of everything that walks in front of them. We run hundreds of camera traps across Africa, North America. They generate millions of photos every single year. And now each of these images taken by a camera trap contains a ton of valuable information, but we need to unlock, we need to extract that information from the camera trap photo. We need to go and figure out what species, how many individuals, what they're doing. We have to turn the photo into numbers that we can then crunch for our analyses. And I once calculated, when I was bored during my PhD, how long it would take me, one person, to classify 1 year of data from 100 camera traps. So 20 seconds an image, 40 hours a week, no, 8 hours a day. No, I did the extreme version. 8 hours a day, no weekends, 52 weeks a year, no holidays, no sick days, no, like, you're working hard. It would take over a year for me to classify 1 year's worth of image data. It would take me longer to process the data than it would have taken me to collect it. So our solution to this massive bottleneck was to crowdsource the data. We threw the data up online. You can go to our websites. You can tell us what's in the image. Anyone can do this, and this becomes real data that we use in real science and real conservation. And when we started this with our flagship, our first project we call Snapshot Serengeti, when we began doing this, putting our data online, I was convinced that like no one would be interested in helping us out, right? Like maybe my grandma's gonna go on for like 5 minutes a day and see a wildebeest and get bored, but like no one, why would you do that? Why would you come and help scientists look at wildebeest? Thousands, hundreds of thousands of volunteers have logged into our platforms over the last couple of years and plowed through hundreds of thousands of millions of camera trap images, turning that processing time from years down to months or even weeks. There's a fierce urgency for us to get these data back, especially if we're using these data for adaptive management or for conservation. And with the help of citizen scientists, with people's participation in science, we're now able to do that. So having these citizen scientists helping us, we were able to start new camera trapping projects and also to help other research and conservation programs across Africa that were struggling with similar bottlenecks. And again, the question is, why are these people helping us? What are they getting? Why are they doing this? You could spend this time having a nap. You could spend this time watching Netflix. Like, what are you doing going online and helping out a scientist do their research? So we did a survey. We did some studies with these people and asked them, what are you getting out of this? And it gives, participating in science gives people a sense of purpose, of contributing to something bigger. And they enjoyed learning about science and about the process of science and learning about us through our engagement with them on these platforms. And so this is when this really got the ball rolling for us to start using these citizen science platforms as a tool, not just for research, but for teaching people about research and the scientific process. So now, in addition to just putting our photos online, we do a lot of outreach. We write blog posts, we do videos from the field, we do social media, we do chats, we do discussion boards, we do meetups, educating people about these projects and about why we're doing what we're doing. And then based on this engagement and the data we're having, we're now we want to get people engaged with these data. We want to use these data to teach students about science. So we're working with teachers and universities in Minnesota and across the world to build educational materials for K-12, fun videos, educational infographics, undergraduates, interactive maps and data query tools and plotting tools. Graduate students, we give them our data. They can use our data to answer real research questions. We want to expand the reach of this project and get real science into the classroom. And we've had a lot of fun building these resources for people to use. And again, the education and the citizen science, it gives us another opportunity to showcase diversity in science, diversity in researchers. You know, this is what a scientist looks like. These are the people who are doing science. These people look like you. You can do this. So citizen science has been a fantastic opportunity to interact with people on sort of a global scale. But as I mentioned before, I think it's important for us to interact with people locally, to give people, the people who I work with in Africa, the students that I work with in Africa, are the future of research and conservation in the country. So I run a number of workshops, of courses, of conservation programs for students, for members of the government, for people in conservation organizations, for anyone interested in getting a handle on how science works in Mozambique, in Tanzania, in South Africa, engaging the people on the ground with their own natural resources and natural capital. So I have a lot of fun in Mozambique and in Tanzania. I work with, in Mozambique, I work with the first and only graduate program in conservation biology. In Tanzania, I work with programs specifically for getting women engaged in science and conservation. I take these students out in the field. We learn about collecting data to ask different kinds of questions. We get our hands dirty. We do a lot of camera traps because camera traps are great. But I have a chance to work with these students to collect, again, real data that becomes the foundation of theses and scientific inquiries. Grubbing around in the field, not all that science is about, so also different courses for how to interpret data, how to take that data and turn it into something you can use for adaptive management, you can use for conservation or policy. And we have these very strong initiatives to try and get women involved in these classes as well, both, you know, to demonstrate to themselves and others that they are just as capable of learning the skills of coding and statistics as anyone else is. And so these programs have been, what's a good word? It's hard to describe. It's been very satisfying in a way that I can't quite articulate, to have the privilege of serving as a mentor to these graduate students, to these students and these actors in the countries, the host countries where I work. These people, again, they'll be going into the government, they'll be going to park services, they'll be going into NGOs and making the policy changes and the conservation decisions that will shape the future of wildlife and wild spaces in their country. And having the chance to try and facilitate that ability for them to make good decisions for wildlife has been a real privilege and something that I didn't think I would be super excited about doing, what has turned out to be one of the best parts of my job. So thank you again. I've talked to you for over an hour about all of my stories, and thank you for listening and for coming with me on this journey, again, from oh woo 8 years ago to doing what I do now. This has been an opportunity for me to, again, change a little bit about what we know about the world. Like, maybe it's not a huge discovery that birds roost in giraffe armpits, but it's something new. And some of these discoveries are maybe a little bit more meaningful than others. But having a chance then again to apply what I know and what I learn and see these to make impacts on the ground has been like, you can make a difference. Like, you can actually make a difference. It seems weird, like, you talk so much about making differences, and then this applied aspect of conservation, you can actually see it in action, and it's worth the blood and sweat and tears and parasites. Like, it's worth everything to be able to do things like this. And again, every student that we grow, every member of the general public who classifies a photo, who reads our blog, who learns a little bit more about science, who increases their scientific literacy, who, you know, like, we suffer so much, I think, in this country right now from a lack of scientific literacy. And other countries, you know, all people don't have the opportunities we have, even here, to grow in science and learn what science is all about. And this making discovery available for everyone, it's important, and there's so many different fun ways to do that, where people have a chance not just to learn about science from a book, but to participate in science as it's happening. And everyone here at OWU, like, you're getting the foundations you need to do this. You have the opportunities here to do these kinds of things. But it's also not, like, there's so many ways to participate in science. It's not just about academia. It's not just about discovering things. It's about teaching. It's about climbing those waterfalls and catching those fish and you know, doing all of these different, catching those snakes. You know, there's so many different ways that we can be involved in the scientific process. And I think the important thing is just to enjoy that adventure and stay curious and have, you know, like, it's such a wonderful opportunity to be a zoologist, and it's been, you know, challenging, but so much fun. So again, thank you. So many of my professors are here. Like, thank you guys for everything, first of all. Like, I'm here now because of you. Thank you, everyone, for listening to me blather on about science. I can do that for forever. Thank you, OWU, for bringing me here and for funding so much of my career. And a blanket thank you to sort of all of the volunteers and mentors and funders who've made these missions of science and discovery and conservation and education possible for me. So if I have any time, I'm happy to take people's questions. People are also more than welcome to contact me after the fact if you have questions as well about graduate school or getting jobs in science or working in Africa or doing education. Drop me a line. We'll chat. So thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've had a lot of really great undergraduate research opportunities. How proactive do students need to be to come into contact with those opportunities, and how do you find out when they're available?
Oh, so I failed a lot. Like, I got a lot of rejections. It was a lot of trying over and over and over again to get those jobs. So it looks very easy, right? Like, do this, get a job. That doesn't happen. So there's a lot of, I relied very heavily on, there's some really great listservs for conservation jobs, for field tech jobs. Texas A&M is a good one, Ecolog is a good one. And I haunted those listservs. I was checking every single day, and a part of the diversity of research experiences I've had is because I applied for everything that looked remotely interesting. And they are interesting. Like, they are interesting, and I applied to a lot of different things. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. Someone turned me down years and years ago from a tech job, and now I hate birds. But it wasn't like I didn't send off one application and I got a job. And there were times where, like the job in Panama working with the tree frogs, I wanted that job. I saw that job advertised and I wanted that job more than anything. And I spent hours crafting that application and got rejected my first year. And I tried again next year. The same job came up and I was like, you gotta let me have this job. And it worked, you know, so it's a process of iteratively like casting a very wide net and trying over and over again for those ones that you think really matter. But there's, yeah, if you do some Googling, there's some great lists for places to find those jobs, those tech jobs, those short-term jobs that are geared at people sort of in the undergraduate and post-undergraduate situation. So keep trying. Like, there's a lot of failure, but it works out in the end.
And here at OWU, if I may,
Yeah,
I mean,
please.
one of the parts of that question was sort of how aggressive do you need to be here? Ask your professors for advice. Go talk to Daryl Albin and the Merrick mentors about opportunities to combine study abroad with research experiences. Apply for theory to practice, and learning from what Meredith just said, if you don't get it the first time, apply again. You know, use the theory to practice not just as a means to get a great experience, but also use it as a means to learn how to ask to participate in this kind of thing. And so talk with your faculty, talk with upperclassmen, put yourself in the way of opportunities.
Yeah.
Wait.
Oh. It's official if you have a microphone.
Thank you. Okay, so how did you go from your PhD to doing what seems like a million things all at once?
They all came organically out of the work that I was doing. So there wasn't a lot of planning. Some things, like opportunities, came up and I pursued them. So like a lot of the educational work that I do, so much of what I do right now is citizen science. I manage 4 or 5 different citizen science platforms, camera traps in North America, camera traps all across Africa, running everything from building those websites, designing the algorithms that process that data, engaging with the citizen scientists. And as I said, that came out of we had all this data and we had no idea how we were gonna handle it. And so we were looking around and we found a website called The Zooniverse had just started up. They had a project called Galaxy Zoo, where they had people looking at pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope. And you would say whether the galaxy in the picture was like red or green or square, I don't know. You identify galaxies in pictures. And we got in touch with them and we were like, we have pictures with things in them that need to be identified. You know, they're not galaxies, they're cooler than galaxies. But so we started that interaction with them, and then that developed into this whole host of different things that I never thought I would be. I just wanted to be out with my binoculars watching animals, and then all of a sudden I'm designing websites for citizen science. So that happened, and a lot of the education I do is grown out of going to the field and recruiting help in the field and seeing how much people wanted to learn and how much people didn't know and things they needed to know, and all of the people who wanted to become engaged in science. And so that organically grew into leading a 3-day workshop, leading a 1-week course, teaching through a university. That kind of happened. So a lot of the things that drove me, the things where there was a plan, was research. And then a lot of these other opportunities came out of different collaborators and different people who wanted to engage with the data and with the science and with the scientists. And those projects sort of came to be, a lot of them came to be unexpectedly. But if you do, I think citizen science is very cool because, I didn't know where I was going with that. It is very cool. I just got back from Tanzania. I'm a little jet lagged. If you have questions about getting into those different facets though of science, because science is the research and the education and the conservation, it's all of those things. And if you have any questions about any one of those specific ones, or you want to become engaged in some of our education, there are opportunities for people to work with us and with our projects, which is another, people can email me about that as well. Does that answer your question? Cool.
So when you were studying field mice, did painting them affect your data at all?
Painting them? So often marking wild animals makes them more vulnerable to predation. This is something that you see a lot, at least in wild African herbivores. If you give one animal a color or a tag and you don't tag anything else, it gives predators something to focus on. With the mice, the only predators that we really had in that system were snakes and they were puff adders, so they were big and fat and slow, and I don't think they did a lot of actively looking at mice before eating them. We did have, I mean, they ate our mice. There would be days where you go out with your radio telemetry tacking a mouse and you end up finding a really fat snake. And then we would have to catch the snakes and put them in buckets until they pooped out our radio transmitters, which was not in the job description, but things you do. So in that situation, the answer would be no, but in other situations, you often do find that that one weird animal, a different animal, whether that's like natural markings or things that researchers have put on them, does sometimes affect their fitness in unfortunate ways. That was a great question.
So you mentioned outsourcing a lot of this interpolation of like those images. Do you ever worry that that kind of undermines the accuracy of your data when you're having a bunch of random people who maybe do not actually care about the science, or it's just, you know, they don't, they
Like trolls.
Right, yeah, right. Or they just don't, they simply don't, you know, they put it in wrong, or, you know, do you ever get worried about that?
Yeah, so we have a system for exactly that. Because if it was one person looking at each image, I would be super concerned that average Joe off the street is either like my little brother wanting to mess up my research project by tagging everything as a hippopotamus, or like someone who like genuinely doesn't know what a hippopotamus looks like. So we do, like on our citizen science platforms, we do have very extensive tutorials and filters that guide people through the process of identifying, sorry, is this squeaking? Okay. Sorry, of identifying different species to help minimize the number of misidentifications. But then we also have 30 people look at each and every single image. So if you guys have heard of the wisdom of the crowds, it's this idea that you can extract from the guesses of a population of people like an incredibly accurate answer. And so we have all of these people look at the images, everyone offers a classification. I have these algorithms that then look at all of that diversity of answers and extract the most likely answer based on the distribution of what people suggested was in the image. And then we do validation as well. So I've gone through and expert identified so many thousands of our photos, and then run those photos through our citizen scientists and through the algorithm, and then compared how does that like wisdom of the crowd's answer compare to my answer. Because that's a big worry, like that's a reason a lot of citizen science didn't get funded when citizen science started to be a big thing, because NSF and all of these big funding organizations were like, these people aren't scientists. They're not trained as scientists. You're using this data that people who aren't scientists made. Like, it's not accurate. It can't be good. It is good. So our, like, again, with this, you know, multiple people viewing the image, for our camera trapping projects, those citizen scientists end up being around 98% accurate compared to my classifications, which is mind-blowing. Like, again, if I was doing classifications 8 hours a day, every single day of the year, I would not be 98% accurate at the end of the day because my eyeballs would be bleeding. Like, you know, like the citizen scientist, it ends up being surprisingly good data. But there is a bit of a process to get good data out of, because there are misidentifications. Like, there are people who don't classify things correctly. And that was a process of trial and error for us to figure that out. So our first couple of seasons of data, we reran over and over again until we found the right number of people to look at it and the right algorithms to use. But now it's quite good. It's good data. That was a great question.
That was a great talk. I'm sorry again that I didn't all those years ago. Being in the field is amazing, and it also carries a lot of challenges, which you talked about. And I was just curious if you could talk some about how you managed being away from your family and your significant other and your friends and all these people that you have to leave behind to go and do this great work.
Yeah, that's really hard. So this year I have been to Africa. I just got back from my 4th trip. I have one more trip planned before the end of the year. I travel not only to Africa, but to conferences and to give talks and to do things like this, which are really, really cool, but also take me away from a lot of like the support in my life. I think you can choose research that gives you more or less exposure to the field. I would say in grad school, I spent between 3 to 6 months of the year in the field. This year, I've spent 7 to 8 months in the field. I won't be spending 7 to 8 months in the field next year. I need a bit of a break. It was really hard for me when I first started out because I was working in places that didn't have internet and didn't have cell phone reception. And that's hard when you can't even send a message, like send an email back home once a week. And so there's like the love of adventure carries you through for a little bit, and then it gets hard. And yeah, I guess now it's easier because I do have internet in my field sites, and I can stay in touch with people at home. And you develop a community in the field. I talked about working in the field like I was working in the field by myself, but I'm often working at research stations that have other people doing other projects there. I'm working with management and scientific services who are often based in the field. In Serengeti National Park, like all kinds of weird people stayed in the field. Like we had people who flew hot air balloons that were based in Serengeti Park year round, and they became our best friends. So you're able to find some community in the field. I think that's very important. I think the people I know who get bushed the most from doing field work are the ones who literally are out there by themselves. So relying on like building a field community, I think is important. Only going to places that have internet is important. And then, yeah, no, next year I think I'm gonna have to tone it down a little bit. I think I'm still trying to find that right balance between not seeing my dogs and like getting the research done that I need to do. Yeah, I don't really have an answer for that. It's just hard. It's hard. But I think what I get out of it makes it worthwhile.
Hello. So I remember you mentioned that when you were doing your PhD and even just being in the field, it's hard for people to take you seriously, not just because you're learning, you're a guppy, but also because you're a woman. How much harder do you think that is when you're in the real world and you have to be asking for grants and you have to be asking for funding? How much harder is it to have to explain what your truth might be to someone who has no idea what you're talking about?
I think in some cases it's easier doing the grant writing and the applying for things because you are a little bit more anonymous in that respect. The areas where I struggled with the hardest were where I had to go to organizations myself and explain myself and be there as myself. And again, a lot of the systems that I work in Africa, like parks and management is all men. It's all older men. Like not to generalize because it's not a blanket situation, but the people I'm working with in the government and the people I'm working with in park systems and the people I'm working with, in order to do that to apply my research or conduct my research or get the funding to do my research, when I'm out there explaining myself, I am a young woman who doesn't know anything. And it's been a process of continuing, like with applying for grants, of just continuing to do the same thing over and over and over again until people start to realize that you're serious. It's going back to the same conferences and reapplying for the same workshops and sending the same emails and having the same phone calls and meeting with the same people every single time you're in the area, whether you need to meet with them or not. to be a face, to be a presence, to establish yourself as part of this community, to establish yourself as a researcher rather than like a person who looks like this. I don't, again, think there's like a specific way to make that change, other than just trying over and over again. But one thing that I do think helps is getting more women out there. None of the people I work with in the wildlife services or the government are women, like none of them. None of the people who manage any of the conservation or funding organizations that I apply to, specifically in Africa to work in these reserves, are women. And I think once we start getting people, like more women researchers moving through the ranks, more women researchers getting into those positions where they are helping to influence those decisions, it'll get better. It's a process, and it needs a lot of buy-in, because it's not a fun process. Like, it's not fun doing that and talking to those people and having them say those things to you, and that process of getting rejected over and over. And I think a lot of people quit, which, you know, if it makes you happy or to do that, you should do that. But you need some people who I think are willing to struggle through it in order to eventually make things better for other people. So I'm hoping, like, I didn't talk about some of the other outreach I do, but I do a lot of mentoring other women in science and Skyping with women's groups and interacting with young girls in science, and trying to build that foundation so that, again, it'll be easier the next go round, you know? It's kind of an obtuse answer. Does that help? I don't have like a single answer for you. I think it's a process of just trying over and over again and getting more people like us in science and sticking with it. More questions? Question, yes.
So I assume with like field work, you're going into a lot of different countries that may have vastly different political or socioeconomic backgrounds than the United States. Mm-hmm. Have you encountered any cultural barriers in your research that you've maybe had to overcome or accommodate?
I think it's a very interesting experience doing research in some of these places, and it varies very widely. So in some places, the research community is a very isolated bubble of researchers from the global north going in and doing our research and not interacting with anyone culturally at all, which is something we're working to change. But there's other systems, especially the places where I'm trying to become more involved with this applied management, where you do get the opportunity to interact with different people, again, who have different backgrounds. I think the hard things are people's, again, expectations of you. What else do I struggle with? There's often, people's expectations of me are hard. There's a lot of language barriers to working in other countries. The 5 places in Africa I've been to this year each speak a different language. And so I know just enough to say just a little in every place, but not enough to be, like, honestly polite. You know, like, not enough to, like, you should make an effort to try and meet these, you're going into these people's countries, to be courteous like that. And I haven't done that yet. I haven't had the opportunity to do that, and that's something I need to be better at doing. Politics can be very difficult to navigate. So that can be everything from getting a visa accepted or getting a research permit accepted to navigating different political climates. So I was just in Mozambique during their political election, and I missed a plane and got stuck in the capital city during the election. 3 people got killed. You know, that's happened to me in South Africa. They have some very tumultuous political situations, and I've had, like, my cars have been stopped and stoned and things like that. So that's, those things can happen. I think the more you engage with those communities, the more you should know about the politics to be able to navigate that sensitively. I think the last thing is getting, how do I want to phrase this? This issue of capacity building that I've been talking about, of sort of decolonializing research. A lot of the long-term research projects that I've worked with in Africa were started in 1960-something by so-and-so from the UK, and they have been for 50 years run by, people pop in from the UK and run these projects, and people in Tanzania and Mozambique and in Zimbabwe want to take ownership of that. It's their parks, it's their animals, it's their natural capital, it's their systems. And sometimes I think that transfer of knowledge doesn't happen very well. I think in some cases, and I've seen this happen a lot in Tanzania recently, the government will come in and tell our projects, like, you're done. 50 years of data, like, it's been great, goodbye. And then they try and start from nothing. They want to do the same thing, but they are putting researchers out there who don't have the same skill sets. They don't, like, we already have 50 collared elephants, but they're recollaring different elephants. Like, they don't know all of the different herds that we've been monitoring for so long. Like, they don't have the data processing skills to turn out the same kinds of white papers and gray papers and manuscripts. And I think there's a way we could do that sensitively. I think there's a way where we could transfer and share and pass the baton of managing wildlife in these countries to the people who are there. But often it doesn't happen. And so, like, again, the capacity building and the classes and the workshops are trying to establish those good relationships with people, to facilitate them learning those skills, but also to build interactions between us and them is not the phrase I want, but like we are a research community now, and their roles in that research community need to be stronger and better. And so one of the hurdles to working in these foreign countries is trying to establish those connections so that we don't lose all of that, everything that we've worked for so hard, and we can continue to maintain that sort of data stream and knowledge stream in a sensitive and productive way for everyone.
So we're hitting on time to release people. We've caught them. Now we need to, But you mentioned passing the baton. And so I'm going to end with the question that I've been sort of posing to all of the Sagan speakers this time. You have a captive room full of largely undergraduates. What advice would you leave them with about how to make the most of their time here?
Oh, yeah, we talked about this at lunch. I've got an answer for this. People were asking me, like, what do you do at OWU, like, if you want to do these things? Like, there's no class at OWU in, like, driving Land Rovers and running away from lions, like, unless things have changed since I was, okay.
Theory into practice.
There's no, like I didn't take a class here specifically on doing what I do now. And I think what prepared me the most and what opened the doors for me to have this strange job with mammals in another country, coming from studying fish and birds here in the States, was just cultivating, like, an appreciation for the entire scientific process of not only doing the learning from classes and books, but in putting a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of effort into getting as many experiences doing real research as possible. And again, like, the whole process, like, everything from coming up with that idea to getting everything down on paper. Professors see that, and hiring organizations see that, and I managed research stations, and, like, those are the things I was looking for, is not necessarily can you do this very specific kind of science, but do you know how to do capital S science? So yeah, getting involved with actual science, doing the independent studies, doing the summer research, bothering people until they let you into their labs and to poke around with the things that they do, I think is probably that was the most valuable thing for me here, is doing real science. And that's not something that people can do at a lot of universities. Like, this is cool and different and special and something that you should take advantage of.
Before we thank Dr. Palmer again for returning and sharing so much of her path and her journey with us, I want to once again thank you all for being here. Remind you that there are a handful of Sagan events left. Please pass the word about Friday's journalism panel to your friends and peers. Let's continue to give our alumni this kind of warm welcome. Also, those of you registered here in Delaware County, tomorrow is election day. Do take the hour out of your lives to make sure you read up about the elections, and please go vote. Thank you.